Welcome everybody to this amazing video here for MBTI and discussing the traps associated with um, Myers-Briggs and the introverted versus extroversion, as it's mostly known as. In this video, we're going to talk about, we're going to take a deeper dive on explaining the introversion extroversion of MBTI, why it's tough and not really usable in real life, and we're going to just break it down in bite size and explain a little bit, and hopefully by the end of this you can see yourself in a different perspective when it comes to extroversion and introversion. I have this conversation all the time hold on, I need to get this up just a little closer. I have this conversation all the time when it comes to, oh, my introvert and my extrovert. And it's very interesting because people don't really realize that, they realize this, but it doesn't speak about it, right? We fluctuate. We're dynamic human beings, right? And when we find ourselves in using these tools like MBTI or Socionics or Enneagram, most of these models by design are built, with a static nature. So what do I mean by static? What I mean is these models, they don't really account for day-to-day flow with your life, who you are. You might be, we're not all the prototypes of these, personality profiles, right? Like if you're an INFJ, you can be an extrovert in some circumstances and an introvert in others, and we'll get into that briefly. So let's dive into this. So let's start with section 1 here, binary trap of MBTI. Okay, MBTI forces you into an E or an I, extroverted or introverted position, no middle ground. So if you are an INFJ, let's just say, for example, your main cognitive superpower here is introverted intuition. If you're ENTJ, you are a extroverted logical powerhouse, right? Extroverted logic, right? So, these are great labels when we think about that, right? And technically, your first letter, according to MBTI, pronounces you, what you are, extrovert, introvert. And for a lot of use cases, this is true. Okay. But the challenge is with this measured static dichotomy here, right? And the thing about MBTI is the dichotomies are fixed, right? And there's no flexibility within them. You are not really accounting for all of the other factors here, right? So just to give you an example, you could be an INFJ and let's just say you're in a situation where you're around a whole bunch of other introverts. Well, guess what? If that excites you, or maybe like really great friends, or maybe you're just, someone asks you about like the future and your thoughts on something specifically. Well, then what's really interesting is you'll become a little bit more extroverted. You're going to be a little bit more open, right? This openness to explore your extroverted side. Right. So, these labels, they're not always, 100% extroverted, 0% introverted. They're not necessarily 50% or 50% here and there. We all have different ranges, strengths, and dimensionalities to ourselves. And in this video, we're talking about extroversion and introversion. So, the takeaway here is that although it's categorical, right? Even though it is real people we're graded on a spectrum, right? And there's merit, we always oscillate between extroverted and introverted and introversion in many ways. Not even just our main way of navigating life, right? So like if you were an INFJ and you have introverted intuition, you navigate a lot, you perceive and interact in life in so many different ways, and you can't narrow your scope down just to your main cognitive function, because there's other use cases for all the other cognitive functions that you have, that you value and not value, and they have their places depending on the state that you're in. We'll talk about that later in the video. So context is also ignored. You can be an extrovert, in the morning, and for a client demo, like if you're an introvert, you can put on your extroverted hat, right? Everybody can do it, and then it could be based on the environment and the role that you find yourself in. It could be situational. You could be situationally introverted, situationally extroverted, right? And the challenge is MBTI does not account for this. Okay. It's like most of these functions most of these ways of being when it comes to MBTI are really more like volume knobs. I like that metaphor, and not necessarily on and off switches. So, right, if you're an introvert, you typically want to keep that introverted dial all the way up or down, and you don't really want to turn up that extroverted because it takes a lot of energy, right? And this is where, like, again, MBTI kind of falls short on information metabolism and how we interact with these different parts of ourself and their orientations and strengths. And many introverts, as you get older, you learn to put on that extrovert hat more freely, and it takes less energy. You learn how to do it yourself, and it grows on you. But when you're not used to it, situationally, if you don't practice it, it's like a muscle. And again, MBTI doesn't really go into this, and if it does, it doesn't go into it rooted in the model that it's born in, right? The system assumes your type is static for life, right? Skills, roles, and life lessons, such as parenthood, leadership, therapy, these reshape how you show up in life, right? Neuroplasticity and deliberate practice matter. Identity isn't frozen, and I speak about this in PRISM. So what I am doing the work on right now is showing that, okay, great, it's nice to have an MBTI label and identity, but when you really move past that, how are we growing on these different sides of ourselves? How are you, if you're an introvert, how are you growing the extroverted version of you? If you're an extrovert, how are you working on the introverted side of you? How are you taking care of yourself and stepping away from everything versus introvert? How are you stepping into the social landscape and that kind of activity, right? And you can rewire your brain and train yourself to get stronger in different ways. And it's not like this static nature. And this is where it really hurts a lot of people who really care to grow and evolve with these systems. You don't have the tools from the systems themselves to give you implementable, actionable insights based off of your core identity. It can't speak for recommendations. So, and to pivot here, labels become self-fulfilling. Okay, so what does that mean? If you're, I'm an introvert, so I don't present, becomes a ceiling, right? Swap to presenting costs energy, I'll design recovery, right? So we can't, when we attach ourselves to these core personality types, such as MBTI, we're just going to keep with the example here, INFJ. It's tough because you self-identify with this role, and it becomes self-fulfilling. You can become more introvert. You can start embodying the bias of these core types. When you think about these core types and being just static and like, okay, cool, I'm an INFJ, I'm an introvert, I'm a powerhouse for vision and understanding depth and the universe and whatever, and very great with people. But when you start taking on these fixed character traits, it can limit you to practicing and experiencing the other side of who you are, and it creates kind of like a reject bias. So, your language, your ideas, they shape your behavior. Using these labels proactively can really help and benefit your life, but just attaching your identity, to these types can be a cage. It can be a limiting factor when it comes to your own growth. It's super really important to understand that, because the work I'm doing on, it's like the opposite. It's like this is you have your core identity with Prism, but then it's like you have all these other things and mechanics happening, with you, and you start to realize, okay, cool, I have a core type that I like to reside in, but beyond this, there's all this change happening. And you want to account for this change. You want to account for this change every day, every week, every month. You want to move with how you're working so you can really, at the end of the day, grow as an individual, grow on your information elements, your cognitive functions, and then at the end of the day, be in flow state as much as possible because that's where you shine. Even science disagrees here, right? So many people retest into a different E or I letter, right? We retake these tests that are like 50, 60, 70 questions long. And you take these tests and then you retest a different core type. And that doesn't really give you much validity and foundation to stand and walk on. A lot of people, they really, they go to the Reddit forums, they go to friends and family, or they go to the other people in the self-development space, and they try to get typed by other individuals. You should be technically typed by an assessment because it's going to be the most objective route you can take when it comes to typing. The challenge is these tests aren't typically designed to be very thorough in their scoring methodologies. And what you have is, very rudimentary and basic scoring methods that aren't, testing for bias and testing. Yeah, okay, they might test functioning, but they're not really going beyond that. And that's tough. And so there's more work on your side to do your due diligence. Now we have a lot of technology out here like AI that can really help you level up your understanding of the self, and it can compensate for where these tests lack. And I'm going to get more into that in later videos. But the science disagrees, with the current testing landscape. So you're more than just your ear or your eye, right? So quick demonstrative idea here. Show a week timeline with E spikes or I spikes, or E spikes or I valleys, right? So track when you're an extrovert, when you're an introvert. Track when you're really putting in that energy versus when you're not. Good. Tracking is always good here. And it can get very granular in your tracking. Why? So section 2 here. Why this doesn't match real life. Okay, personality is fluid and situational. We've kind of spoken on this already. We flex across roles, analyst at work, maybe friend on the weekend, parent at night, right? So, the way that we work as humans, we're so context-based, so situationally based. And, I'm going to use this terminology over and over again, but when we speak about core type, you have your core type of who you are, and then you have like the build out of where your current strengths and dimensionality are with what you're working with, right? But then you add in these factors of different situations. You got your work you, your mother or father you, your friend version of you, if you showing up in different formats, and this takes on different roles of the self, different performances of you, and this is going to look different for everybody. And also, when it comes to stress, confidence, and environmental shifts, as I'm saying, under pressure, some go outward, some go inward. Okay, some are, you can become more decisive. You can talk fast, or you can talk slower. You can have lower energy, higher energy. It all depends, on your current state. I speak about this in PRISM, where we talk about your different states of stress, confidence, performance. These can all take on a different version of you, and you shift away from your core, type. You can be an INFJ and then shift to an ENFJ in a place of stress. You can be an ENTJ like myself, and you can shift to a INTJ under stress. An ENTJ normally, but under stress, I'm an INTJ, or maybe under Performance, I look like an ESTJ, right? And we need to account for these variations, not toss them aside. So two introverts can look opposite, right? So, you have, high anxiety, avoid, you can avoid groups and debates, prefer written input. So you can have two. So I'll give you an example of two people, right? Here I have Ava, high anxiety, avoids group debates, prefers written input. And you have Marco, calm, baseline, quiet in crowds, but animated in one-on-one mentoring. Same introversion, different operating system, right? So this really goes to show that, yeah, okay, you can be an introvert, but everybody's going to look a little different with that introversion, right? And this is where it's really tough to connect to MBTI, because in MBTI, these dichotomies of the introversion and extroversion and judging and perceiving, they're kind of, these static labels don't account for the dynamics of this individuality of how our operating systems are different. Binary erases nuances, okay? Which is, again, this is kind of like the common theme here, which is, it hides the intensity, skill, and state. The question isn't which state, it's how strong, when, and why, right? And when you don't account for these factors, then you can't really use this in your day-to-day. You can't really use this in your life. Just having the I and E staple, okay, great, but like, how am I using this in my day-to-day life? You have to account for this. And when you think about this in terms of like really getting strategic about it, like, how strong are these parts of me, right? When do I show these parts? Why, how, right? Asking like these really deep questions can give you more of a deeper insight than what these typical labels normally do. So where do you gain your energy? Where do you perform best? And where do you need recovery? I talk to a lot of people, especially when it comes to salespeople. For the past year, I've been working with, last year and a half, year and change, I've been working with sales individuals, and I always bring this up with them in their reviews. Like, hey, you're an introvert. Like, you have to take these things into consideration. When are you doing your outreach? When are you taking your time to rest? When are you pacing yourself as an introvert? And even as an extrovert, right? Like, you can be all over the place. Let's take a step back. Let's become introverted to understand, to strategize, and then get back out there, right? So you're, depending on your mode, requires, a different process for energy. You have all these different things that can, all these different questions that, if discovered, can really help your day-to-day flow. So moving on to section 3 here. Beyond binary dimensionality, 1D versus 4D. So here's where we enter PRISM, the dynamic upgrade. Okay. So, you have dimensionality in PRISM, right? Which speaks a little bit more on than just like I and E. Okay. So 4D represents the expert, and that's also flexible. 3D is strong, 2D is reliable, familiar lanes, it's normative. 1D is fragile and needs support, and it's all based off of experience. You can only grow via experience. So PRISM measures strength of use, not just presence. Okay, so depending on what type of information element is this, like we'll use the INFJ for example. How strong is this? Like, are you operating this information element in its 4D dimension, as it would be? It's the primary for an INFJ, right? So instead of measuring strength, right, of use, not just presence, instead of your E, PRISM shows how powerfully you run functions like extroverted sensing, action, or extroverted feeling, social energy, right? So we want to measure our cognitive functions or information elements. You want to track this. You want to understand the strength and depth that you have of who you are. Like, it's all like, think about it as all like one dashboard, and how strong and weak you are in all of these, and how loud or surface level or how deep and knowing these cognitive functions are to you. So and you can track this throughout your week and throughout your days, right? Like you start tracking like and what's observable in yourself in every circumstance, you can review this and see a pattern. I recommend, journaling with AI to make this easy so you can really understand like your day-to-day processes. Um, and your emotional overlays matter as well. A calm introvert versus an anxious introvert behave very differently. PRISM tracks these state effects explicitly, right? So depending if you're in a calm position or an anxious or stressed position, your introverted, your introversion or extroversion sides, depending on which one that you prioritize first, depending on your core type, your neuroticism levels, or in PRISM, we measure neuroticism, stress, calmness, right? And if you're a calm introvert, you might be more open to be extroverted. If you are a tense and stressed and anxious introvert, then might be you might either become more introverted, more siloed, or you might just represent an extroverted archetype of yourself, right? Where you're an INTJ, and under stress and pressure, you become more like an ENTJ, right? Things get more like heightened, right? And you want to be able to understand, especially, and then, by the way, being in a stressed or anxious place, um, it affects your scoring and it impacts your test results, right? So if you're not in a great place for your core type, and some types correlate more and less with neuroticism, right? You want to make sure that you're operating in a healthy space when you take these tests, and when you don't, it's always good to retest, right? Um, so let's see if I want to mention anything else here. Dynamic expression, state modulation. Right. So let's talk about state modulation and real quick, right? So state modulation, right? It's you have to see it as like you're kind of bouncing. You're usually your core type, and we always want to be in our main core type for flow, right? But you modulate to different subtypes, derivatives of your core, from your core type, however you want to label it. So if your confidence is up, you'll stretch into higher seats more easily. Stressed or depleted, you'll collapse to your safest lanes, right? And I was explaining this to a friend the other day. I was explaining, when you're in a stressed out place, you're going to be actually less, you're going to be less forgiving. I was talking to an INFP the other day, and when she's under stress, she's actually more critical, of her core values in her environment, versus when she's in flow, she's more forgiving, and she's more like, she's more workable with people. Imagine if you're an INFP and all you're seeing around you in a stressed out state is how people are not showing up for others in a bad way, or they're not showing up to a standard that an INFP would want you to show up, and that getting under their skin. And so it's, you know the interesting thing is, when we are in a stress space for, and again, the context here, we're speaking about our primary functions here. You know, of course, just because you have a superpower of your first function does not mean that it's not impacted by your states. Um, Great example for me, when I'm in a stressed out place, I go way more introvert intuition. I go way more NI. I go way more internal. I become more of an introvert than an extrovert, and I get way more unforgiving when it comes to common sense and pragmatic logic, and if something sounds right or not, if someone's speaking and calling people stupid, and all this stuff. And it's not a good look, right? We all end up in those places, but when we're in flow state, with our primaries, things open up. The world opens up in a subtle, in a cool way, and we're way more forgiving, and that expression looks differently in different states. Okay, so a good takeaway here is MBTI asks, are you E or I, right? Strict and static. Okay. And PRISM asks, how do you show up across tasks, states, and seasons? And how can you level up, right? How can you level up your understanding, your dimensionality, your strengths? Um, Use type as a starting point. Use dimensionality to design your work, recovery, and growth, right? So so even from here, you could see how you can transition from static to dynamic, right? This gives a whole new breadth of work to be done when you start understanding these states and how you modulate between states. This is all I have for you for this segment here on INE. Hope this was a good help to you guys. If you want to connect with me, I am living these days in the applied personality lab community. Links in description. I am also living on YouTube a little bit more, on LinkedIn, and I'm also doing a lot of work on the PRISMPersonality.com website, where I am aiming to elevate the level of quality and likelihood of first type accuracy with my assessment. You can take it at PRISMPersonality.com. I'm also going to be creating a applied personality lab podcast where you can find these longer video versions, or the audios at least. I'm going to figure out how the video works, but if you thought this was meaningful and helpful, please like and subscribe, and comment down below your experience with introverted and extroversion, and how this video may potentially help you, and maybe some actionables you can take in to your everyday life. Hope to see you around, and thanks for tuning in.